Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. We're glad you're here. And now our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
Hey, everyone, it's Dr. Mike Patterson. Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast. I'm glad you're here. As I get older, I'm always amazed when I reflect on how much has changed in the workplace over the course of my lifetime. Some of the changes were evolutionary, while others have been revolutionary. When it comes to remote work and remote teams, it's been a bit of both. We have to go all the way back to when I was in middle school, 1973 to be exact, to find the origins of this now ubiquitous movement. The term telework was coined by Jack Nillis and his co-authors as they wrestled with the issue of traffic congestion of all things. They argued that we could never build enough roads to solve the traffic problem in major cities. And since I've spent most of my career in Los Angeles, I completely get it and tend to agree. They argued back then that the real solution would be found through technology and improved methods of communication. Others started to get on board, but slowly. Fast forward 20 years to 1993, and we find management thinker Peter Drucker declaring that commuting to the office is obsolete. But even with the wise one's pronouncement, corporate executives resisted. Some even adamantly resisted. Perhaps the best known example of this is in 2019 when newly appointed Yahoo CEO Marissa Mayer sent out a company-wide memo that put an end to all remote work at Yahoo. By 2018, only around 3% of American employees reported that they worked more than half of their hours remotely. Fast forward just a couple of years after that, and nearly all of us were forced to work remotely due to the pandemic. And many of us weren't ready. Now, some people are still working remotely and others are headed back to the office, but many of the principles of leading highly effective teams are the same. Today, I'm offering my conversation with Dr. David Burkus, a best-selling author of several books, a speaker, and a thought leader in two parts. Quite honestly, there was so much good stuff in our conversation that I wanted to divide it into two episodes to make it easier for folks to consume. I encourage you to listen to both parts in full because you don't want to miss any of the good ideas and practical tips that Dr. David offers us. It's a great conversation.
Welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast, where we talk about better business results, stronger teams, more successful careers, and happier lives. Along the way, we hope to bust some biases, build some bridges, and have some fun. We're glad you're here. And now, our host, Dr. Mike Patterson.
Well, my guest today is Dr. David Burkus. David is considered one of the top business thought leaders in the world by Thinkers 50. He's a sought-after keynote speaker with a TED Talk that's been viewed over 2 million times and an active consultant who has a track record with some of the world's top organizations. He's the author of several highly acclaimed books, and today, we're going to dig into his latest book, Leading from Anywhere, The Essential Guide to Managing Remote Teams. It's a book about the past, present, and future of remote teams and how leaders can thrive in that future. It's a topic that's been top of mind for many leaders that I've spoken with over the last couple of years, so I'm excited to dig into it today. I read the book this week and found it to be packed with practical tips that were grounded in scholarly research. It is jam-packed. At the end of every chapter, there's 3 or 4 or 5 things that you can start doing right away. And I think that's incredibly valuable for boots on the ground kind of leaders like most of our listeners. It's also very conversational and easy to engage with David's writing style. So even if David wasn't my guest today, I would highly recommend his book and encourage you to run out and buy it. But the good news is that Dr. David Burkus is with us today. David, welcome to the Mission First People Always podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
I love your book and I'm excited to talk with you about it today. And I would imagine most of our listeners either work or lead remotely, at least some of the time, now, and they will at some point, and if they don't now, they're going to do so in some point in the future, probably the very near future. When we start down this path of remote leadership, what are some of the basic rules of the road that can help remote teams get off to a good start?
Well, it's funny. I was asked a similar question around like, okay, what separates good from bad managers in a remote context, et cetera. And it's actually ironically the same thing I would say in a co-located environment, right? Presence doesn't equal productivity, right? I mean, we somewhere along the line, management by walking around got twisted into this idea of monitoring when people are around, right? And judging the productivity, especially if you have an amorphous task where it's not easy, like, something like sales or manufacturing, it's kind of easy to judge productivity, but a lot of knowledge work jobs, it's incredibly difficult. And so we ended up just using, well, they're here early. They come in at like 8:15 every morning and they stay till 5:30, sometimes 6 o'clock. They must be productive. Like, no, they're just here often. We don't actually know what they're doing. And when the great work from home experiment started, in the spring of 2020, a lot of those same leaders really struggled because now what do you measure? If you don't have presence, how are we measuring productivity, et cetera? And so they turned into responsiveness. This is where all of the endless Zoom meetings that everyone was on for the first several months, and some people still 2 years later, it came from is, I need to be able to see you to know that you're working. No, it never really did, right? Even before the pandemic, people that had a lot of different places to choose where they did specific tasks tended to be more productive. Now, I say that, and that seems like, oh, that's not all that deep. No, but it is, because it requires a tremendous amount of trust being built between you and the people you lead and between team members. It requires a tremendous amount of trust to be able to not equate presence or responsiveness to emails or presence in a Zoom call with productivity. And that trust, that's what I think most leaders could probably start building first on that team, is how do we build both a competency-based trust? We know people are actually going to deliver. We can rely on each other, but also sort of a character-based trust. We know people aren't going to embarrass us or insult us or things like that. That tends to be one of those key elements for managing a remote team, which is ironic because it's pretty important to co-located teams too. It just becomes more important when you're not around them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you talk about this in the book, but how does one develop trust when I don't see you very often, or I'm not physically with you very often, and I'm trying to resist this temptation to call meetings on a daily basis to check in with you? How do we develop trust with our team members when we don't see them on a daily basis and we're trying not to consume their time with meetings?
Yeah, well, it's really simple. You line everyone up and you have the first person in line fall backwards and get caught. I'm kidding. You don't use the trust falls. That's not what you actually do. One of the things we know from the research on trust is it's a really tricky thing, right? I say it in the book, trust is a chemical. Literally the human emotion of feeling trusted or bestowing trust in somebody else triggers the chemical oxytocin in the brain. That's the bonding hormone. That's the one that we use to have emotional bonds with all sorts of people, friends, family, et cetera. And it applies to the workplace too. And what we know from how it all works is that trust is actually a reciprocal process. It takes a sort of a give. It's not like trust is given. It's not like trust is earned. It's reciprocated. It takes somebody being vulnerable or somebody willing to go out on a limb first, and that triggers another person on the team to feel trusted. That simulates a release of oxytocin, and then that actually triggers them to act in more trustworthy behavior. So you have this virtuous cycle of trust, or a vicious cycle of distrust if you're not sort of doing these things. In a remote context, that usually looks like using some of the time that you are having synchronous communication to express vulnerability, either vulnerability in here's what I'm struggling with and feeling overloaded, here's where I need help, here's where I don't have all of the answers, et cetera. It takes being that, usually the leader, but it can be other folks as well. It takes a person who's willing to be vulnerable. That signals to other people that person is trusted, right? And that begins the process of building what we might call affect-based trust, if we want to get super nerdy on the research, but trust in the person, right? Trust in them as a human. A competency-based trust, which is just trust and reliability, is built over time as people are more reliable. So we're not that will either take care of itself, or there'll be certain members of your team that you'll have to invite to no longer be remote because they can't be trusted remotely, right? Or can't be trusted at all, in which case you'll invite them to be a part of a different team. So that affect-based trust, that comes from that virtuous cycle. And it usually starts with some willingness of fallibility. And what we find, at least over the last 2 years, is that works better in synchronous communication versus in an email or something like that.
That makes a ton of sense, David, but why do managers, why do leaders, why are they hesitant to present themselves in that way, to be vulnerable, to open up? Is there something about how we've trained leaders over the years that tell us to be strong and stoic and don't show emotion, or are we beyond that at this point?
Yes to all of the above. I think the conversation is shifting, but let's just be honest. We still, most of us, work in a system that rewards competency in individual contributor jobs with leadership positions. So in other words, you did a great job. You had all the answers. You got stuff done. You rolled up your sleeves. You put in the hustle, et cetera. And now we're rewarding you with that leadership role. So what do you think when you're struggling? What image do you think you're going to try and convey to everyone? Well, it's going to be the image that got you promoted. My friend and mentor, Marshall Goldsmith, loves to say, what got you here won't get you there. And that's true at just about every level of leadership in an organization. There's a new thing to learn. I think the moment you move from an individual contributor to a team leader, your big what got you here won't get you there moment is that you may have mistakenly got this position because of your competency in the role, but it's your willingness to have open, honest conversations with the team that's going to build their competency and hence your leadership ability.
The other important partner to trust as you're building culture, according to you in the book, is respect. How does trust and respect go hand in hand as you're trying to build this culture? The line, Peter Drucker's famous line, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," it rings in my head constantly. And I think about creating this positive kind of culture, both for face-to-face teams and remote teams, and respect is a big part of it. How do you build respect in that remote environment that you write about?
Yeah. And so these are sort of two sides of the same coin, if we will, right? Trust and respect are the two sort of component elements of what we might call psychological safety. That's a term that thankfully is getting more popular now, 30 years after Amy Edmondson started her research on it, but is finally kind of getting its day in court, which is great. And if you think about that, remember I talked about the virtuous or vicious cycle, right? There's an easy way to think about how they interplay between them, right? Because trust kind of comes first, but respect is what signals whether or not the trust cycle kicks off or if it turns into a distrust cycle. Trust is what I need to feel in order to disclose information, fallibility, my authentic self to you. Respected is how I need to feel in order to continue that trust. If I trust you, I'll share something open with you. If I feel that you acted respectfully, that you heard me, that you didn't judge me, that you considered the benefit of my different perspective, even if we disagree, then that kicks off the virtuous cycle of psychological safety, if you will, right? So the reason we talk about this at length in the book is that it's harder to do in a remote environment. It's important for every single team, trust and respect both, but it's a lot harder to do. It's harder to make sure people feel heard and respected on a Zoom call, especially when you're back to back on Zoom calls. And so you actually keep a tighter agenda than you would in an in-person meeting. It's hard to get people to really engage in the level of debate via email that they would in person. And then as we all see from just about every social media company out there, they're all sort of flaming dumpster fires of people being disrespectful to each other because it's hard to remember there are people on the other end of those pixels, right? So how do you do it? Well, leaders model the way, right? And this is nothing new. You make sure that you're taking the time to encourage dissent. You make sure you're taking the time to demonstrate active listening and repeating back, even when someone disagrees with you, making sure you understand their stance before you try and rebut it, if you even try and rebut it. So you teach people how to fight right, how to make sure that they're demonstrating respectful conflict, and your team will follow those ground rules. It may take an actual intervention where you set out the ground rules as a team, but more often it's caught instead of taught. In fact, we say this in the book. Christine Porath, who's the world's most respected researcher on respect, has a fascinating survey of like 20,000 employees across the world. And the number one reason they gave for why they'd been the recipient of rude or disrespectful behavior on their team was a lack of a demonstration of civility or respect from leadership. In other words, our leaders act this way, so of course this is how it's okay to act.
Yeah, I like to tell that environment you're describing, or call that environment you're describing, healthy opposition, where it's okay to disagree. There's a ancient Hebrew proverb that I often quote, and it's as iron sharpens iron, so one friend sharpens another. And so I think that healthy opposition is important to drive creativity, innovation, efficiency, all those things that we don't get if everyone's just nodding and smiling and getting along, or seeming to get along, or afraid to push back because of the response. It's an unsafe environment and people aren't going to respond that way. So very practically, you mentioned encouraging dissent or opposing views, as I might say. How exactly would you do that in a Zoom meeting where you're trying to come up with an approach to, or a plan, or a project timeline? How do you do that with someone who's, a little face on a postage size image on a screen? How do you do that?
Yeah. I mean, so the postage stamp thing, it's exactly right. Or if they have bad bandwidth, it's hard to even see the changes in their facial expression. Like in the room, you could tell from body language that they have a different idea than you, and you could call them out or ease them into it if you haven't built that level of trust and respect yet. Now, on a Zoom call, you really just have to open the floor more for it, right? So I'll give you two ideas. One is sort of smaller, and then if you're having big problems, you should try the second. But you really have to open the floor. Like we have this tendency to only kind of call for dissenting opinions towards the end of a meeting or the end of a discussion, right? So in other words, there's 1 minute left before we move on to the next agenda item, or before we close the meeting, and we go, okay, any comment?
Vote. Yeah.
Right. Or comments, concerns, clarifications. That's my favorite, right? All of us have been on the receiving end of that.
Right.
Before we close, who has any comments, concerns, clarifications? It's like you know what I liken that to? I liken it to when you're at a wedding and the officiant says, if anyone has any reasons why these two should not be wed, right? You know, you're not supposed to say anything.
Yeah. Right? I keep waiting to hear somebody jump up and say, no, don't do it. But I never have.
No, that only happens in like soap operas, right?
Yeah. Or romantic comedies or something.
Right, exactly. But we do the same thing. We don't open the floor enough. So we got to make sure we have time for it in the agenda. We need to not do it right at the end. And usually I find that if you take it on yourself and you express some of that vulnerability as you're doing it, you can get a better response. So in other words, not, okay, who has any questions, concerns, clarifications, but you could say something like, it sounds like we're headed to consensus on that idea, but that just might be my biases and my background and my way of seeing things. So before we move on, what are we potentially missing? Do you hear the difference in that from comments,
Yes.
concerns, clarifications, right? So that's a small scale way, and then be comfortable in the silence to make sure that people have that opportunity. What sometimes happens in teams that really lack this trust and respect piece is if you open the floor like that, you'll still get nothing until the meeting's over. And then you get the email or the text message or the phone call from that one member of your team who really wanted to speak up, but he didn't feel like he could. Right. And that's your time to have the conversation with that one person and then mention to that person, no, I would absolutely love it if next time you could do that. Right. You might even have to take a different person that has more, outgoing nature the next meeting and actually tell them ahead of time to do that, to speak up at this moment, because I need to demonstrate that we're about this discussion so that other people on the team can see it, right? You often have to have that person who goes first, which is either you by taking it on yourself, what am I missing? Or by having somebody that has a decent level of trust and candor with you on the team that is willing to be that first person so others can see that person isn't, shot down and embarrassed and ridiculed. And then they begin to trust that, oh yeah, this leader actually does care to hear about diverse viewpoints.
Yeah. And that reminds me, David, of the Google Project Aristotle research that you also mentioned in the book. One of the factors affecting team performance, or one of the characteristics of excellent teams, is that everybody talks. Everybody talks roughly about the same amount of time. And I think you've given us some great advice on how to get the people who are a little hesitant, maybe less courageous, at least initially, to share ideas. You got to prompt them a little bit and pull them into the conversation. And of course, make it safe for them to stay there.
Yeah. No. And actually, so that That was a finding in Project Aristotle, which is one of my favorite studies on culture in general. It actually sort of was an unknown replication of some research from Anita Williams-Woolley, Christopher Chabris, and I'm blanking on the other two researchers, but that's what happens now. The world of research is a team sport too now. But anyway, in Anita Williams-Woolley's research, they found that the biggest factors on team success were what they called collective intelligence. In other words, teams that were smarter than what the average IQ of all of its members would have indicated. Those teams were marked by a more equitable distribution of conversation, so turn taking in conversations, and B, more women on the team. Which, that actually, you'd think that would be like the easy one. Okay, that's great. We just need to do that. What they lump both of those together and say that it requires a social sensitivity was the term they started using. Just so happens that women generally are more socially sensitive to who hasn't spoken and all that sort of stuff than men tend to be. But I think that was in all of that research was done on in-person teams. So I think it's even more important. We have the tools to put people on mute when they're over talkers. Yeah. So it should be easier to make sure we're hearing from everyone now. And at least anecdotally, it feels like we're doing it less than we were doing it with in-person teams.
Yeah. One of the other aspects of culture you talk about in the book is the importance of finding a common purpose. And you use this question, and you did a really nice job putting it in front of my eyes there in a way that made me think about it in a new way. What are you fighting for? Why is that? What are you fighting for question so helpful for teams trying to identify their purpose?
Yeah. So I sort of stumbled into this one, and I get people who disagree with me about that word fight. I get it. I don't mean it like, who are you fighting? Like a question of competitors, and certainly not internal people that you're fighting. I mean, the larger like crusade, the larger goal, the way that people say we're fighting for justice in the world, or we're fighting to revolutionize the industry. That's the level. I just found, again, sort of anecdotally working with a lot of different organizations, that when it came to discussions about mission and vision and purpose, first of all, there wasn't a lot of clarity on the differences between all of those things, but that's we could do a whole other interview on that. But I could cut through the clutter, and I could figure out whether or not somebody had truly internalized the organization's mission. If I said, when we think about the work that we're doing here, what are we fighting for? What's the big thing that we're fighting to change, or what's the big thing that we're fighting to support? So I started using that term often. I was actually exploring that before the pandemic happened. I sort of dripped that idea out there in a project we did with Audible, and then the world shut down. So what the world needed was to focus in all this research on remote work. So I'm kind of excited about this for almost 5 years now, looking at how easily you can unify people around what in psychology research we might call a superordinate goal, by pointing to something that is bigger than our team, but requires our team to work together in order to achieve it. This isn't just hitting our quarterly objectives. This isn't just the mission statement. This is about how we see our role in fulfilling the mission. And so that became my favorite question to ask is what are we fighting for? Is there a way we can get shared purpose raised to the level of seeing what we do as a crusade? And especially in a remote world, as we could see it to the people that it helps. Sometimes when I work with clients who really don't want to use the fight word, I switch the question to who is served by the work we're doing, to sort of to reemphasize it on that people thing. Because again, if you're in your spare bedroom and you're on Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, purpose is a really difficult thing to feel on a regular basis.
Yeah, and we also know that if people recognize that sense of purpose is also personally meaningful to them and tied into their own personal values, and they can make that very real connection, that's how we get people engaged, how we get people fired up. They stick around, they don't want to leave, they're more committed. All those good things happen when people can connect their personal sense of purpose with the team sense of purpose. So I think it's a critically important question.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that we know from the scholarly research and practice is that people who feel connected with their teammates are more engaged. If they're connected to the purpose, they're more engaged. But if they feel connected to their teammates, they're more engaged. They're less likely to leave. They're more creative. They make better decisions. During the pandemic, when people were unexpectedly forced to work remotely, we attended classes remotely. We were unable to gather with family and friends. People got lonely. They expressed these feelings of loneliness, and some people fell into depression. I mean, I had graduate students who made far less progress on their research projects because they just didn't have the energy. They just couldn't, find themselves engaged or muster that energy to do the work. How do leaders help people feel connected to each other in a fully remote virtual team sort of environment?
Yeah, it's certainly the Zoom happy hours we were doing in like March, April, May of 2020 didn't really help, right? I think we all got a little hungover from those, right? And it's not from the alcohol; it's from the fact that the last thing we all needed was more Zoom,
force fun,
right? Yeah, fundatory, right? Or one of my friends calls it recommendatory activities, right? There is a kernel of truth in those, and I think what we were trying to get at, which is that we know that friendships, like you covered all of the research brilliantly, that friendships and having a friend at work, there's a reason it's one of Gallup's top 12 questions to ask for judging engagement. We know that matters at work. And certainly it's harder to build remotely. Prior to the pandemic, I never actually worked with or studied a single remote first organization that didn't use in-person gatherings in order to build those bonds. Right now, obviously, over the last 2 years, for health reasons, we didn't. But what we find is the brilliant thing that happens in those is that people find what are sometimes called uncommon commonalities, things that you and I might have in common. We found one, literally you caught a little thing in my book that discovered this whole uncommon commonality that creates the beginning of a little bond. It certainly creates more reasons than just work to stay in touch. So we end up texting that person or calling that person more often, maybe even making it more likely that we, if you have a situation where you're working remotely, but everybody was still in the same city because they used to be in an office, you start to see those people maybe even have one-on-one meetings once they started to be comfortable. We saw this a lot as the sort of restrictions started easing. Because those bonds turn into those friendships. They're built on finding those things that people have in common. And the way you create those often in an in-person environment is doing nothing at all, right? Just having time either before or after a meeting where you're socializing, having the dinner after, almost every company meeting I ever attended, the most valuable part about it was lunch and dinner, right? Not the actual information shared, which is unfortunate if you think about it from a company internal meeting, but there's some value there, right?
For sure. And you and I were in pharma, so we probably had our share of
we had one every
3-hour company dinners at meetings.
Yeah, no, totally. Exactly. How you do that. Now, how do you do that in a virtual? Well, we found out it's not just get everyone on a Zoom call and then do nothing. It has to be sort of a little bit more structured. We have to actually, whether that's structured icebreakers, whether that's games or shared experiences, there usually has to be something else that is the reason that people are there and kind of their focus. And then it happens afterwards. And I'll be honest with you, I hate that I'm saying this, right? Because I find icebreakers dorky and lame. I just think they're sort of, when you play little games, they're just sort of cheesy. But the research actually on this is really cool. There was actually a study that just came out from Francesca Gino and a few others that even when people hate the little team building rituals, small scale stuff, I'm not talking about let's go on a 7-day ropes course. Or orienteering course. I'm talking about the small little icebreakers, like let's all share a rose and a thorn, right? Those seem dorky, but they actually do move the needle on how people find uncommon commonalities, how they connect with the team, and as a result, their performance. So even if you're like me and you find them kind of lame, like it's worth doing them because they actually do work.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to create a stronger, more people-centric and empowered culture for your organization, visit drmikepatterson.com.